Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on your Saturday. I know that there's probably a lot of other more fun things to do than sit around and listen to people tell you about how depressing our industrialized food system is today. But I am definitely going to be giving you the bad news. Katy is going to give you the good news. And so you won't be leaving here feeling like you don't have some tools and things that you can do to help move Indiana towards a more sustainable future. So with that, I am just going to start diving in. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. Give me 1 second. Hopefully I do this correctly. Beginning. There we go. Jenny, are the slides being shared?
They are, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, great. So there's my contact information, my email address. Feel free to contact me offline if you want to talk more about anything that I'm going to say today. But I'm going to dive right in. So for more than a decade, I've been working with communities across Indiana to stop the proliferation of factory farms. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that, you know, factory farms are really just inevitable and necessary to feed the world because our population is growing and it's expected to reach 10 billion people by 2050. Well, this is a myth, and today we're going to dispel that myth. It's a myth that's perpetuated by huge multinational corporations that now dominate global food production to protect their bottom lines. And the truth is, as you'll hear today, the only way we're going to be able to feed the world sustainably and without destroying our planet and ourselves in the process is to do away with factory farms. In fact, you may be surprised to know that the world already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. The real problem is that much of that food goes to feed factory farmed livestock instead of people. A staggering amount of land, water, and energy resources go to growing the vast monocrops of corn and soy that go to feed factory farmed animals, not to grow crops for direct human consumption. So as a result of this hugely inefficient system that we have now, that of feeding billions of farm animals to, quote, feed the world, not only doesn't feed the world very well at all, it's a leading cause of the most serious environmental problems we face at every scale from local to global, including climate change. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And so first I'm going to cover how we got the industrialized food system that we have, one that's controlled by a handful of large corporations. After all, our food system wasn't always this way, and understanding how to fix it requires understanding what broke it in the first place. We're also going to talk about why the current system is a problem for all of us, not just rural farming communities. People who live in cities and urban areas all suffer from the ill effects of our broken food system. And we believe that making this connection for people on issues that they care about, because we all care about different things, is how we're going to grow the movement for change. I'm also going to talk about how our existing laws and policies have failed to protect us and address the problem, and what we can do about it, both in terms of policy advocacy and as consumers. Katy Rogers, the farm manager with Teeter Organic Farm, is going to be joining me today after I present all the bad news and get you all depressed. Katy's going to present some good news. She's going to talk about what a sustainable, regenerative, local, diverse food system looks like. At the end of her presentation and mine, I think we're going to have plenty of time for a good question and answer session and opportunity to have a discussion and answer all of the questions that you might have. As Jenny mentioned earlier, please pose any questions that you have in the chat box. If you don't have the chat box open, just click down below where you see chat and that'll open up and you can type your questions in there and we'll make sure to answer them at the end. Also, no need to take notes. Everything I'm going to cover today is discussed in detail in a citizen guide that I think is going to be emailed to you after, if it hasn't already, after today's presentation, but it's also available on HEC's website at hecweb.org. So let's dive in. Let's start with how we got here. You might think that corporate consolidation and industrialization of our food system was just the inevitable result of the Industrial Revolution, where technologies improved and farm families left the country, realizing that they could make a better living in the city. And while this is true to some extent, much of what happened is the result of carefully developed and successfully implemented policies to purposefully eliminate factory farms. Let's talk about that. So this all started back in the mid-1950s when leaders of major US corporations, you may not be able to read it, but some are listed there, including Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Sears Roebuck and Company, Standard Oil, Johnson & Johnson, American Electric Company, Hormel, Heinz, Eastman Kodak, and others, all came together as part of the Committee on Economic Development, or the CED. This is a business policy think tank that was formed after the Great Depression. It's still in existence today. And back in the mid-1950s, the CED proposed an adaptive program for agriculture. Now, this CED policy proposal is referenced in numerous scholarly articles, books, and other writings as being pivotal to the changes in farm policy that gave rise to our current food system. The copy that I was able to find had somebody else's writing on it. So you'll see as we kind of go through some of this policy, like the dark scribble writing that you see up at the top. So that I can't help, but the yellow underlining that you see on these slides is mine. So the purpose of the CED's adaptive program was to address what these corporate leaders saw as the American farm problem that in their view was undermining economic growth and their corporate financial interests. Namely, their problem was that there was too many farmers and not enough factory workers and laborers in other sectors, what they characterized as the, quote, inadequate flow of resources out of farming. To fix this farm problem, these industry leaders proposed to reduce the farm labor force by 1/3 over a short 5-year period, which would involve, quote, moving off the farm about 2 million of the then 5.5 million farmers. To do this, they proposed dramatically lowering the government price supports for farmers that had been in place since the Great Depression, so that small farmers would no longer be able to make a living and would get out of farming. According to the CED, doing this would add 2 million people to the urban labor pool, which would tend to depress wages overall and lead to cheaper labor costs. It would also lower the cost of raw materials for food and clothing companies, and it would increase the return on corporate investment in agriculture. So in other words, this plan was aimed at benefiting big industries' bottom line. Particularly insidious in my view, these industry leaders recognized that policy change wouldn't be enough to push generational farmers out of farming fast enough, that it would also require cultural change. And on that front, they proposed, you'll see here on the slide, quote, investing in projects that break up village life, because village life is a major source of opposition to change. Soon after, Congress held hearings on the CED's proposal in which farmers and farming groups across the country all testified in opposition. Unfortunately, federal farm policy soon followed the proposal with instructions to farmers to get big or get out, which they did in droves. Since the 1950s, as you see on the slide, the United States has lost more than 3 million farms. In addition, government supports shifted from ensuring that farmers received a fair price for their products to ensuring instead cheap commodity prices for big agribusiness. All of this served the intended purpose of expanding corporate consolidation and control of food production. And so now today, nearly 90% of all ag subsidies go to the largest farms. Also today, just a handful of large corporations now control food production, especially in the meat industry. To be specific about that, Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef Packing Company now control 83% of beef production in the United States. Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and Smithfield control 66% of pork production. These same companies, Tyson, JBS, Purdue, and Pilgrim's, control more than half of poultry production. And you should know that under our antitrust laws, market consolidation above 45% is considered highly concentrated and likely abusive. So how do these corporations control farming? Well, through vertical integration, the corporations control all stages of meat production, from genetics, birthing, feeding, transport, slaughter, processing, marketing, to grocery store packaging. And as the farming groups warned Congress way back in the 1950s that this would squeeze out small farmers and create an unlevel playing field, that's exactly what happened. Small farmers were squeezed out of the market because they couldn't compete. And as a result, this decimated our rural farming communities by also eliminating the local infrastructure and businesses that once served the community's farmers. So today, instead of family farmers raising livestock for local consumers, there are now roughly 25,000 industrial-scale livestock operations in our country, known as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. And these CAFOs produce the vast majority of farm animals that are raised and slaughtered each year in the United States. To be specific about that, according to the most recent USDA agricultural census, approximately 70% of cows, 98% of pigs, 99% of turkeys, and 98% of chickens that are raised for meat are raised in factory farms, just like the one you see in this picture. The same is true in Indiana. We have roughly 1,700 factory farms where the vast majority of food animals are produced. And what I want to point out in this slide is that the dots don't really give you the full picture. These facilities are growing fewer in number. You'll see that back in 2012, we had over 1,900 CAFOs and smaller CFOs. And today we've got fewer facilities, but much larger ones. So now we have 796 CAFOs and 943 CFOs. So in just a decade, we have 168 more of the largest facilities and 395 fewer smaller factory farms, but we're producing more animals than ever. In fact, we rank second nationally for egg production with 26.4 million laying hens. 90% of those, or 24 million, are confined in just 25 factory farms in Indiana. We also lead the country in hog production, ranking sixth nationally with 11.3 million hogs sold every year. 91% of those come from just 516 hog factories in Indiana. Why should we care about all this? Aside from the inequity of displacing millions of farm families over the last several decades and decimating farming communities, why should any of us who live in urban areas care about the fact that most of our meat, dairy, and poultry products come from factory farms? So that's what I want to talk about next. First, we should all care because the waste storage and disposal practices used at factory farms has now made our water unsafe to drink, swim, and fish in. We know based on government data that the leading source of water contamination in Indiana continues to be pathogenic E. coli, which indicates that animal waste is present in our waterways. Now, E. coli contamination is due in part to releases of human waste from our failing infrastructure like combined sewer overflows and failing septic systems. But we also know that most of the states, that most of the contamination is coming from the state's factory farms. So how do we know this? Well, we also know from our state agency IDEM's recent 2020 water impairment report that it concludes that confined feeding operations are by far the top source of impairment of Indiana streams. This makes sense because livestock generate a whole heck of a lot more waste than humans do. Livestock in the United States generate an estimated 335 million tons of waste annually, more than 40 times that produced by the human population. Indiana is no different. Our livestock generate as much urine and feces as that produced by 87 million people, or 14 times the human population of Indiana. Hamilton County is no different. You all actually in Hamilton County, for those of you who live there, have relatively few CAFOs and CFOs, currently 5. But even those, based on the type of animals that are confined there, those 5 facilities generate 3 times the amount of urine and feces produced by the entire population of Noblesville. And just because this is livestock waste instead of human waste doesn't make it any less harmful. In fact, the pollution strength of raw manure was determined by US EPA to be as much as 110 times greater. The pollution strength of raw manure is 110 times greater than that of raw municipal sewage and is therefore arguably more harmful than human waste. Even so, despite all this evidence, our current laws allow livestock waste to be stored in unlined earthen lagoons, like you see in the pictures there, and then sprayed and treated on land, whereas human waste must be treated before it's ever released into the environment. So now, of the 9 watersheds tracked in IDEM's water assessment, an average of 98% of stream miles were deemed not suitable for recreational use because of pathogenic E. coli contamination. In other words, our lakes and streams are seriously polluted with animal waste, and some of those polluted streams are in Hamilton County. So another reason all of us should be concerned about CAFOs is because they pollute our air with noxious emissions, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, particulate matter, endotoxins, and other chemical compounds known to pose serious health risks for people who live nearby. For instance, a Purdue University study found that an average-sized dairy CAFO with 4,000 cows will emit as much as 660 pounds of ammonia into the air every day, or 120 tons per year, which is far above the threshold for regulation under the Federal Clean Air Act, yet factory farms remain exempt from regulation to this day. These gases are dispersed into the surrounding area where people live in a number of ways. First, factory farms that have waste pits underneath in the confinement buildings, like in that top photo you see there. There are large ventilation fans, like you see in the picture, that pull the gases out of the buildings and blow it into the outside air. Because if you allow the gases to accumulate inside the buildings where the animals are, it could kill the animals. This is most often used with hog CAFOs. Factory farms that have open air football field size lagoons, like you see in the picture there, allows perpetual off-gassing to occur. And then when these pits and lagoons fill up, they spray the waste untreated on surrounding land, like you see in the bottom picture. And when that happens, the sprayed waste easily blows with the wind to surrounding properties. Of course, common sense tells us that if a brief exposure to a mere 60 gallons of urine and feces collected in a typical porta pot, if that's uncomfortable, which it is, Exposure to the stench of millions of gallons of livestock waste in a massive pit or lagoon can be unbearable. And I can tell you that it absolutely is. I've experienced it several times when I've gone to communities who are suffering with this and have been made very sick each time. Another reason we should all be concerned about factory farms is the rise of antibiotic-resistant disease due to the use of overuse of antibiotics in livestock and factory farms. According to the FDA, about 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are fed to non-disease livestock at factory farms to promote their growth and ward off the stress and disease caused from living in unnatural confined conditions. And as confirmed by the CDC, this prophylactic use of antibiotics in non-disease livestock, that is non-sick livestock, has contributed to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in humans through our food. In fact, some infections now resist multiple antibiotics. One example is MRSA, which you've probably heard of, and it's a pathogen that now takes more lives each year than HIV/AIDS. Due to these serious public health threats, the American Public Health Association announced last year a policy statement advising federal, state, and local governments to impose a moratorium on all new and expanding CAFOs until these public health concerns are addressed. Unfortunately, Congress has yet to act. So another reason we should all care is that in addition to air and water pollution and antibiotic-resistant disease, the meat industry is also the leading cause of climate change. According to the most recent report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, meat and dairy production is the #1 source of all human-caused greenhouse gases. The meat industry is also the largest user of land. 30% of the land surface of the planet goes to waste. It's also the cause of habitat destruction and species extinction. So let's explore that. I want to explain why that is. About 70 billion farm animals, billion with a B, are raised every year worldwide, more than 10 billion in the United States alone, and more than 6 million are killed for food every hour. It takes a lot of land to grow the amount of grain needed to feed those 70 billion farm animals. In fact, it takes 16 pounds of grain to make just 1 pound of beef. In the United States alone, our livestock eat more than 50% of the grain that we produce. Raising 70 billion animals every year requires a lot of water too. Animal agriculture is responsible for nearly 30% of all freshwater consumption in the world and nearly 50% of water used in the United States. And as this slide shows, it takes 2,400 gallons of water just to produce a pound of meat versus 25 gallons of water for a pound of wheat. So that shows you the highly inefficient use of our resources to make food. This staggering inefficient use of our resources is particularly disturbing from a humanitarian perspective, given that we currently grow enough food to feed more than 10 billion people, but 50% of it is going to feed livestock. Also concerning, 82% of starving children live in countries where food is grown to feed livestock that are eaten by people in Western countries. Indeed, 15 times more protein could be produced on a given area of land by growing plants for direct human consumption rather than feeding it to livestock. So if destroying the planet isn't enough reason to care about factory farms, there's also the systemic abuse of farm animals. I think it's important to point out that just like our dogs and cats, the billions of animals that we raise and kill each year for meat are sentient, complex beings and capable of feeling pain, frustration, joy, and excitement. Yet these animals are viewed by the meat industries as mere commodities to be produced and as a result, they suffer a myriad of assaults to their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Unfortunately, there aren't any federal laws that protect farmed animals from this cruelty, and the majority of states, including Indiana, exempt the industry's, quote, accepted agricultural practices, which include CAFOs, no matter how abusive, from the scope of animal cruelty statutes. So simply put, the treatment of factory farmed animals is inhumane and cruel, but it's perfectly legal. And I'm going to give you a few examples of these legal practices, generally accepted livestock production practices. For instance, chickens are confined by the tens of thousands in grower houses, like you see in this picture, which are artificially lit, force ventilated, and completely barren, except for long rows of feeders and drinkers. And due to selective breeding, these birds grow abnormally fast and large, which causes them to suffer gait defects, broken bones, and severe pain. Once they reach market weight, these birds are stuffed in crates for transport, where they often suffer dislocated and broken hips, legs, and wings, as well as internal hemorrhages. Also, during their journey to slaughter, these birds, like other factory farmed animals, are not given any food or water and are afforded little, if any, protection from extreme temperatures. At the slaughter plant, these birds are uncrated, dumped onto conveyors, and hung upside down in shackles by their legs as they pass through an electrified water bath before their throats are cut, usually by a machine. And due to the rapid speed of the slaughter lines, mistakes occur, leaving some birds still conscious as they enter tanks of scalding water intended to loosen their feathers. Chickens in the egg industry also suffer immensely, beginning right after hatching. Male chicks are considered useless byproducts because they're unable to lay eggs and aren't bred for meat production. As a result, millions of baby chicks each year are gassed and thrown into garbage bins where they're left to die from dehydration or asphyxiation. Female chicks, in turn, are mutilated without any pain relief when the tips of their beaks are seared off with a hot blade to prevent them from pecking and engaging in other harmful behaviors that result from intensive confinement. For that matter, most egg-laying hens are confined in small wire, what are called battery cages, that are no larger than an 8 by 11 sheet of paper, and they're stacked several tiers high and extend down long warehouses. It's so small that these birds are sometimes unable to even turn around, and it's so small it's impossible for them to spread their wings or engage in natural behaviors such as dust bathing, foraging, or nesting. The more than 235 million pigs that we slaughter each year in the US don't fare much better. Sows are put through consecutive cycles of impregnation, giving birth and nursing, all while intensively confined. And although pigs are highly intelligent social animals, pregnant sows are kept in metal gestation crates like you see here that are so small they're unable to turn around. Right before giving birth, the mama pigs are moved to equally restrictive farrowing crates like you see here. These are designed to keep them from crushing their nursing piglets. However, the crates are so small that the pigs can only stand up and lie down. And then after their piglets are weaned, the cycle begins again, and the mother pig churns out an average of 2.5 litters every year until she can no longer produce and is sent to slaughter. Finally, cows in the dairy industry similarly endure endless cycles of artificial insemination, mechanized milking, and giving birth. Many are routinely given hormones to increase their milk production. It's said that the amount of work done by an average dairy cow during peak lactation is so immense that it's comparable to a human jogging for 6 hours every day, almost year round. So although cows can naturally live for more than 20 years, the average dairy cow is spent and sent to slaughter before she reaches the age of 5. Now, these are just a few of the livestock industry's incredibly cruel and inhumane practices that treat animals as commodities for profit instead of living, feeling creatures. Animal cruelty, climate change, air and water pollution concerns aside, The meat industry is also costing us our health in terms of obesity, cardiac disease, and other illnesses related to excess meat consumption. You might be surprised to know that today the average American eats roughly 200 pounds of meat every single year, which is more than 6 times what the average American consumed in the 1930s. Why are we eating so much meat compared to our grandparents and great-grandparents? Well, today it's much cheaper to eat a bacon double cheeseburger than it is to eat a salad. And that's because, going back to what we talked about earlier, the meat industry is now heavily subsidized, whereas fruit and vegetable farmers only get the tiniest sliver of taxpayer help. So back in the day, the true cost of eating meat was actually reflected in the price. So, having a Sunday roast was something that didn't happened once a week. We didn't eat as much meat because it was more expensive. The true cost was, again, actually reflected in the price. From a nutrition standpoint, our out-of-whack food subsidies are out of line with what's recommended for good nutrition. So as you see on this slide, what's recommended in the top corner there, sort of a balance of fruits and vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy. Yet the vast majority of subsidies go to dairy, grains, with a little bit going to fruits and veggies. We're not subsidizing what we're saying is healthy. And that's especially harmful in terms of health outcomes for low-income families who live in food deserts and can't afford to eat health food. So given all this impact and harm, you might wonder, well, where are our laws? Don't they protect us? And as I'll briefly present, the answer to that question is no. There's very serious gaps in federal and state environmental regulations. Starting with the Clean Water Act, for those of you policy wonks out there, back in 2011, you can look up this case, the National Pork Producers versus EPA. This decision effectively gutted EPA's authority to regulate CAFOs under the Clean Water Act. Since that decision, the roughly 25,000 CAFOs in the United States that were regulated, now less than 8,000 of them are subject to Clean Water Act oversight. And same is true in Indiana. All of the 796 CAFOs that would have been subject to Clean Water Act permitting, all are now subject to state regulation under IDEM's Confined Feeding Operation Rule, or CFO rule. And there's serious gaps in our state CFO rule. For starters, there's no consideration of property values or whether land use or siting decisions are appropriate. There are no limits on air pollution, and there's no disclosure in the permitting process of the corporate integrator, which is actually the big company calling the shots. So when something goes wrong, we're not holding the right entity accountable. Also, under Indiana law, manure pits and lagoons can be built in karst terrain and other sensitive area. Karst terrain is where you have sinkholes and other easy ways for surface contamination waste to reach groundwater. Manure lagoons can be located 100 feet from on-site water wells and property lines, which would include parks and public spaces. They only have to be 300 feet from or set back from surface waters, drainage inlets, sinkholes, and off-site water wells. And really problematic for rural communities. They can be located just 400 feet from adjacent homes, churches, and schools. And that 400 feet is not from the property line, it's structure to structure. So if your home is 300 feet from your property line, a CAFO can be built just 100 feet from your property line and use that 300 feet of your property essentially as a pollution easement. Also problematic, as long as a proposed new or expanding CAFO meets these meager requirements, IDEM, our state agency, has no authority to deny a permit to protect surrounding neighbors. For that matter, IDEM has not denied a single permit in the 10 years since the CFO rule was amended in 2012 following that decision from the Fifth Circuit that gutted the EPA's authority. Also, despite significant data from numerous scientific and industry-funded studies showing that CAFOs generate noxious odors and produce dangerous air emissions that threaten the health of people who live nearby, CAFOs, as I stated before, remain unregulated under the Clean Air Act, and IDEM's CFO rule lacks any regulatory limits on air pollution from CAFOs. Indiana, like many other agricultural states, has a Right to Farm Act that bars neighbors harmed by factory farms from seeking damages in court, even if the neighbors were there long before the CAFO was built next door. And this has just really turned the intent of the Right to Farm Act on its head. This law was enacted in the late 70s in response to urban sprawl, and the idea was to prevent city dwellers from moving to the country next to an existing farm, not liking the smell and suing the farmer. But that's not what the law does any longer. Now, if you're a small generational farmer or someone who's lived in rural Indiana all your life, a CAFO can move next to you, and the Right to Farm Act will strip your ability to seek damages in court when you're harmed. If you want to learn more about this movie, Right to Harm, it's really good. It dives into pretty significant detail of this issue. So what can we do now that I've depressed everyone? I don't want to leave you hanging. We don't have to accept this, right? There are things we can do. And the first thing that we all have to do is to get involved in the legislative process and advocate, which is what I call it, for policies that promote the sustainable food system that we want, starting with ending those massive taxpayer subsidies that go to big corporate ag and reallocating that subsidy support to independent farmers using regenerative practices and the money that's needed to rebuild that infrastructure that local farmers need to serve their local communities. So to do that requires that we tell our representatives in Congress what we want to see in the next farm bill, which is when those subsidies get reallocated. And you should know that the current farm bill was enacted in December of 2018, and it expires in 2023. So the biggest factor in how the next farm bill turns out is actually who will control Congress in 2023. So for now, Hamilton County is, I say for now because I know these districts are going to be redrawn, but for now, Hamilton County is in the 5th congressional district, excuse me, and represented by Senator Todd Young and Senator Mike Braun in the Senate, and then in the House, Representative Victoria Sparks. A little bit about them. Senator Young voted for the current farm bill. He is up for re-election in November of 2022, so you should definitely weigh in with him and tell him to reallocate that support for independent small farmers. Senator Mike Braun, he was elected in 2018, so he didn't get to vote on the current farm bill. A hopeful note about him, he's introduced some legislation on climate change, so he might be more open to hearing our concerns about inequitable tax subsidies. So definitely weigh in with him on the farm bill. And then House Representative Victoria Sparks, she was elected in 2020. So she likewise didn't get to vote on the farm bill, and it's not really clear where she stands, but nevertheless, please weigh in with her now. You can get contact information at www.gov.track.us for how to reach these representatives and senators. The second policy reform that we need to get behind is the Farm System Reform Act, which was introduced by Senator Cory Booker. This bill has several co-sponsors in the House and Senate, and it's supported by more than 300 sustainable farming groups, animal welfare, environmental and public health organizations, including HEC and the Indiana Farmers Union. What would it do? Well, critically, it would strengthen our antitrust laws to crack down on the monopolistic practices of the multinational meat packers and corporate integrators. So it would level the playing field. It would place an immediate moratorium on new and expanding CAFOs and would phase them out by 2040. It would hold the corporate integrators responsible for pollution caused and other harm caused by their CAFOs. And it would provide a voluntary buyout for farmers who want to transition out of operating a CAFO. Now, we've made it easy. HEC is definitely behind this law. We've made it easy for folks to reach out to their congressional representatives. If you go to our website, www.hecweb.org, and link down under the issues to our factory farm page, you can click on this link and submit a letter. You can personalize it. We've got several, draft ones already there for you, but you can personalize it and send it to Senators Todd Young and to Representative Sparks right through our website. So please check that out and take action. Ultimately, it's up to you to decide whether to support an industrial food system or a sustainable one. And happily, you don't have to wait around for policy reform to do it. You can create consumer demand for sustainably produced food by voting with your food dollars. So instead of buying industrial produced meat and dairy at chain or big box grocery stores, buy it from local and regional farmers who sell at farmers markets, CSAs, buying clubs, and food co-ops that connect local Indiana farmers to consumers year-round. A great searchable online database for CSAs and food co-ops is available at localharvest.org. A quick search on there for Hamilton County CSAs and local farms revealed 17 listings. So you've got a lot to choose from there, including Teeter Organic Farm, which you'll hear more about from our guest speaker, Katy Rogers. And regardless of where you buy your food, one of the most impactful things you can do is to eat less meat and dairy. According to the World Sustainably, if we all made plant-based food the star of our diets, with animal-based products playing a very minor role. With that, I am going to show a brief video, and then we're going to turn it over to Katy. Let's see if I can figure this out without messing things up. There we go. Jenny, can you see that?
Not yet.
How about now?
Now I can, yes.
Okay, I'm going to hit play. Hopefully the sound comes through.
Food,
Can you
I'm
hear
a
it?
total sucker.
Yes.
Whether it's sugar or grease or carbs, pretty much bring it on. And I spend a lot of time in Montana. So for me, that medium rare grass-fed ribeye steak, pretty much as good as it gets. I know, I don't do it often. And when I do, I gotta admit, I feel a little conflicted. And that's for a lot of reasons, including the planet. But how big of a problem is what I eat? I mean, does it really make much of a dent in something as huge as global warming? It turns out what we put on our plates matters a lot.
About 25% of all the global climate change problems we're seeing can be attributed back to the food and the choices that we're actually making about what we eat on a daily basis. This is greater than all the cars on the planet. In fact, it's about twice as much global warming pollution as the cars.
Ben Holton and Maya Almaroz study the connection between climate and diet at the University of California, Davis. They track how the way we produce food creates greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. With that data, the team has crunched the numbers to figure out how much carbon pollution is produced by different foods and different diets.
A lot of people feel really helpless when it comes to climate change, like they can't make a difference. And what our research is showing is that your personal decisions really can have a big impact.
So take that grass-fed ribeye steak I love. If you really look at everything that went into making a single serving of beef, you end up emitting around 330 grams of carbon. That's like driving a car 3 miles. Now, if I choose to have chicken instead, there's more than a 5-fold drop in emissions. Switch to fish, and you see the number go down even more. Now, look at veggies. If I swapped beef out entirely for lentils, well, I'm down to practically nothing. So why does beef, and lamb too for that matter, pack such a powerful punch to the planet? Livestock accounts for a little over 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If that sort of seems low to you, consider it's about equal to transportation. We're talking all the cars, trucks, planes, trains, and ships on the planet combined. This is partly because ruminant animals like cows and sheep, they're just gassy. And the methane they produce is at least 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Plus, it takes a lot of land, fertilizer, and about 1 billion tons of grain to feed all that livestock.
And you could feed 3.5 billion people with that grain. If we were just directly eating these grains ourselves, it would eliminate a lot of the CO2 that's emitted from cattle production.
So it's clear that meat has a pretty big carbon load. But it's also worth remembering that not all livestock is raised equally. In parts of the American West, for instance, ranchers are working to raise livestock in ways that actually help restore the land. And they're experimenting with ways that soil and grasslands can be used to keep carbon pollution out of the air. But even these sustainable ranchers will really tell you we're probably eating too much meat.
I know a lot of people who, if you don't serve them meat for lunch or dinner, they're kind of like, well, when is the meat coming out?
It's to the point now where the US actually has one of the highest meat footprints per capita. So what about not eating meat at all? Vegan is the way to go for the least impact on the planet, but it's not that much different in terms of emissions than, say, a vegetarian diet. And the team found that the environmental impact of the Mediterranean diet is pretty similar to vegan and vegetarian diets. It's a lot less meat heavy than what Americans are used to, so fish and poultry a few times a week, beef maybe once a month, plenty of plant-based foods, and of course, loads of olive oil.
Eliminating like 90% of your meat intake is more important than eliminating all of your meat. We don't all have to be vegan. We don't all even have to be vegetarian. If we can just reduce our meat intake, every little bit helps. And if you can bring it down a lot, you can help the climate a lot.
If we all just switched to a Mediterranean diet, it could actually solve 15% of global warming pollution by 2050.
If everyone were to move toward it, that is equivalent to taking somewhere around 1 billion cars off of the streets in terms of vehicle emissions each year. So that kind of a footprint is big time.
But say you still want more meat than the Mediterranean diet recommends. Just cutting down your portion size to the doctor recommended 4 ounces can reduce your emissions by half. That's huge.
In fact, the doctors are telling us we're eating about twice as much meat as we really need for a healthy diet.
The good news is we are listening to our doctors. In the last decade, there's been a 19% drop in the amount of beef we eat.
All these things that you're already being told are good for you also happen to be good for the planet.
So what we eat really is a big part of the climate puzzle. I mean, we may not all be able to afford an electric car or putting solar panels on our house, but we all have to eat every day. And these choices we make can add up to really big numbers. And since meat has a pretty big carbon load, we need to be thoughtful about how much we eat. As for that ribeye steak that I really love, I am honestly trying to cut back. Maybe just a smaller piece of steak, or simply swapping out a meat dish for a veggie burger. It may seem like a small thing, but it really does add up to big impacts. Hey, so what did you have for dinner last night? Find out how your choices are affecting global warming by taking a quiz at climate.universityofcalifornia.edu, or watch one of our other episodes to discover what happened.
Yeah, I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with the internet on the end. That was the end, though, correct? Maybe.
Sorry about that. Let's see. I've got to get out of here. There we go. Sorry, guys. All right, let me get back to where we were. Okay. Okay, well, you know what? We're just going to stop this share. I am going to introduce, I think I hope have given you some tools, and that video, you know,
Kim, your internet, it
really
sounds like
very well.
I believe your internet is it must be your rural internet. It's yeah, it's kind of warping your speaking. So it only did it for a few seconds. So
oh boy.
Try again. Otherwise I'll take over and we'll introduce Katy.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Actually, yeah, that's great now.
Okay, I think my computer is just probably going crazy with all this screen sharing and back and forth. It just doesn't know what to do. I know I'm confused as I could be. Anyway, I hope that my portion, the intent of my portion of the presentation today was to give you the honest, full truth picture of what the problem is, because it is a serious problem and there's really no way to sugarcoat it. But we can all play a part by being engaged in the legislative process and advocating for sound, common sense, reasonable policies that help support the food system that we want, as well as making informed food choices. You know, at HEC, we're not advocating that everybody be a vegan or a vegetarian. We recognize that's a personal choice for each person, but at least recognize the tremendous impact that eating meat and dairy does have, and try to reduce, which is so key, as we saw in that video. Another really important aspect of this, which I am not an expert on, but Katy Rogers is in presenting what that sustainable food system actually looks like, right? It's easy to say we want a sustainable, regenerative, local food system, but how does it work? Can it really feed all of us? Is it economically viable for farmers? What are, you know, we all hear these terms: organic, free range, sustainable, cage free. Does that mean anything? Can we rely on that? And Katy is going to cover all of that. She has been doing this work for, I want to say 20 years almost, at least. Something you can talk a little bit more about your background, Katy. But she has worked in agriculture, not only for industrial producers, but also on sustainable local farms, including now being farm manager of Teeter Organic Farm. So she brings a really interesting perspective in having worked in all aspects of animal agriculture. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Katy, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim. Wow, there's so much good information. I'm going to have to go back and replay this and steal some of your sources there. And you covered a lot of really good action items for us. So if there's redundancies here, I'll try and rush through some of those. But I'm also going to try and leave question time at the end for both of us so that we can address what this particular crowd would like to have addressed. So I'm going to start screen sharing here. Let me, there we are. Okay. And Jenny, do I need to remove the bar?
It looks good from here.
Okay. All
yeah.
Right. Wonderful. I will try and pop through this. So let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm coming to this work as a stakeholder on many fronts. So I live on the White River. I think that when we talk about the river and the health of the river, that is the most immediate thing, is that I have contact with that water on a regular basis. My kids want to swim in that water. So this being aimed at the White River basin and watershed is particularly poignant for me when I pull in my driveway later. I'm also coming to this as a farmer, currently a diversified specialty crop grower, but I have worked up and down the food supply chain. So I've worked for 2 different variations of confined animal feeding operations, the CAFOs that Kim discussed. I have pumped pits and lagoons. So the slides that Kim showed of the cesspools, the pits and lagoons are where the runoff from the confined animal feeding operations go. And when you drive by farms, sometimes you'll see that being sprayed out into fields. I have also been a party to an EPA investigation because we were pumping a pit, and the farmer had broken field tile, and it went into the Wabash River and created a fish kill. And so as a member of the company that was part of that pumping operation, that was a fascinating thing, because at the time we had a really good paying job for a 19-year-old to handle hog manure, liquid hog manure, and had no idea and no environmental training whatsoever at that point. So it was a harsh wake-up call that what we were doing, however unintentionally, could be a significant environmental problem. And I always tell people, when it comes to my experience in the food supply chain, that I've worked from soil and seed research all the way through to the emergency room. So that's the entire food chain there. And it's a dark way to look at it. But seed research, corn research, test plots in particular, and through soil health initiatives. And now in this very interesting space that I get to work in at Teeter. I'm also a parent, so I care very much about how my actions are impacting my children, and maybe someday grandchildren, and yours, and my neighbors. So that's who I am, coming to this in a nutshell. I'm also coming to this with this fascinating thing that's been happening for the last 3 or 4 years of my life, where as I've entered into the regenerative and sustainable spaces and started practicing agroecology for the last almost 12 years now, I have had farmers my parents' age, so late 70s, frequently come up to me, and when they find out what I'm doing, they let me know that they have some regrets over decisions that they made or situations they were in, and that there are some things they wish they had known or done differently in their agricultural practices. And so I carry that weight with me when I make decisions, when I talk to farming groups in particular. I don't know how many farmers versus consumers are on the call today, but I am acutely aware of how often someone sees me out working and pulls in and asks if I'm the farmer, and then wants to talk to me and says, hey, you kids, at my age even, you kids are doing better. So that's encouraging, but it's a weight that we carry, an awareness that 40 years from now, our kids are going to be living with the decisions that we made today on so many levels. This work is not just being done by farmers. As you know, HEC and groups like REAMP are doing a lot in this space to facilitate farmers. So I'm going to be speaking to you for the next 20 minutes or so, and at times I'm going to be speaking to farmers, but primarily what I'd like to do is, as consumers, I'd like you to understand the situation farmers are in, and I think that will help you better communicate and better understand the situation, and then make going forward something you can do with more boldness. So farmers, hero complexes aside, because of legislative hype, we tend to be early adopters. We tend to be innovators, and to jump on things that are expressed as progress for us. So when a farm is set up and you see these barns or these facilities set up, you can be fairly confident that the farmer did not invest their life and go into debt with some nefarious intent. Everybody got this information and they said, here's what you can do, and this is efficient, and there's a pitch, and it seemed like it was the way to go forward for the food system. So as we get more information, this thing I harp about constantly, my team knows this, as we get more information, we have to act accordingly. So it's time for farmers to move forward once more. We have learned several lessons in my space. One, we cannot industrialize biological processes. Another thing that I say a lot. Most of the things that I learned in other career spaces absolutely do not apply on a farm. It is an entirely different world with its own structures and silos. We don't want to conflate exploitation with efficiency. One of the negative effects that has happened in the food supply in the United States is that we are dependent on getting things as cheap as possible, not just for consumers, but in order for a farm to be profitable. This leads to all kinds of labor issues, particularly in confined animal feeding operations. The CAFO space is not, for most people, a reasonable workspace. So there are people there who would rather be doing anything else and have no options. And that exploitation of the most vulnerable people in the workforce is something that needs to be addressed honestly. We also, when I talked about, we have taken on what we do with the best of intentions and not lightly. Now that we know some of those practices, particularly confinement feeding operations, are antiquated, we need to move forward with a more broad view of how we impact the environment, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, big ideas for consumers and for farmers. What should we be doing at all times? Focus on prioritizing human and ecological health. Here's the thing. Human and ecological health is one thing, right? Just like you can't take an animal, you know, a rabbit or something, and stick it in a box this big and let its environment get disgusting and out of balance and take away all the things that it needs to thrive and think that it's going to be healthy. You can't do that with human beings either. So our health is dependent on ecological health, and those trends hold through all of the research that we have available to us about human health and science, and soil health, human health, and smog and air pollution and water pollution and all of these things. So the first thing I do every time I have to relocate, the first thing that I do is find doctors. But then I look to see if there's any environmental cleanup sites in the immediate vicinity. And then I check water quality and air quality, because all of that is together. And if I'm going to take my family into a space, I need to understand all of that. Well, I have a direct impact on that as well. And the other thing we need to do as consumers and as people in agriculture is continuously be educating ourselves, right? So innovation and education are the way we need to move forward. And when we're not sure what to do, recenter on those two principles. For farmers, it can be extremely difficult to make major transitions. I'm going to describe some regenerative systems to you in a few minutes, but I want you to keep in mind, as a bit of an apologist for people, as someone who came out of a conventional agriculture space and has made a massive transition in my methods. Farmers generally are caught in a debt cycle. That is the standard for the United States. 75% of arable land is by people who are so upside down financially, is run by them. So there is some, with debt comes an almost enslavement to what you're doing before you can get out. So we're looking at legislative options that help farmers with that situation. Time. What I do now with a diversified farm is more of a time hustle. Instead of planting for 10 days a year, I'm planting for 110 days a year, all different crops. I'm not specializing in 1 or 2 crops. I'm specializing in 40 to 45 crops. So it is a completely different career in some ways, and it does take more time, and the transition takes an inordinate amount of time. Supply chains are not designed for small growers, diversified growers, table crop growers, specialty crops. You'll hear me say specialty crops a lot. That's what we call most of the food crops. If it's going directly into human beings, it's typically considered a specialty crop. Labor is an issue. Labor is an issue on all farms. It is a different kind of issue on a diversified or a regenerative farm. Regeneratively raised cattle, for instance, would be moved daily or every other day in an intensified grazing rotation, which can involve moving fences and water supply systems and having people on site constantly, people who have high skill levels and that kind of thing. So you have to really be on top of it. Our current paradigms and the things that we've already learned are sometimes a hindrance to us. I know that's not just in agriculture, but when we relearn something and you kind of have to unlearn the old ways, I still reflexively sometimes respond to a disease or an insect in the field and have to pull myself back before I make a decision about how to do that, because that was ingrained in me for quite some time. there's not a lot of support in the agriculture community for people transitioning over to regenerative or sustainable systems. It's a hard reality if you're a farmer or if you're someone who wants to make that transition and to progress that way. That is a very difficult thing. My conversations with farmers change very much based on where they're coming from, because we have internalized what we're doing as part of our identity. And as such, anything that you do differently from what I'm doing, if I've internalized that, feels like a personal attack. Not just a difference of opinion or trying something out. It can feel like a personal attack. And if your systems are ingrained 3 generations deep, it really feels like a personal attack. And of course, as Kim did such a great job of covering, policy favors what's happening now. That's how we got here, right? It wasn't that farmers went out and came up with these ideas. It was that these ideas were come up with and then incentivized and facilitated by policy, by legislation, by practices and the industrial agriculture paradigm. So in the future, it's time for us to go forward again as farmers, as people in agricultural space, and as consumers, you play a huge role in that. So agriculture is the most fundamental human endeavor. And we don't have the luxury of staying where we are with this. Now, paths forward. There are lots of paths forward for both those of us who are agricultural practitioners and for consumers. These roadblocks are being addressed. You heard what Kim and Jenny have said about contacting people and being involved, just being a voice. I once had a career in politics, and I can tell you that for those phone calls that come in and those emails that come in, even though you're getting a form response that might feel dismissive, there's actually a formula that's being done based on pros and cons, right? And that's how they're determining their constituents' awareness. So please don't think that it doesn't matter this time. Every call, every email matters every time, especially in the rural spaces where we're quite spread out and there's actually less engagement in a lot of these levels of government. So, be aware. I love the Mr. Rogers quote about looking for the helpers. So be the helpers too in this space. I'm going to explain a little bit about the term ecology and agroecology so that you have a sense of what to look for. Then we'll run through some other terms here. And Jenny, if you need to call time on me, just let me know. So in ecology, we have 2 different things happening. We have succession, which is the natural reproduction and life cycles of everything in an ecological system. And we have disturbances, and disturbances can be natural or they can be implemented by one of us. And farming is a disturbance. The level of disturbance is what determines the upset in the ecological system. So these are the kinds of disturbances that you see from meat producers, vegetable producers, commodities, row crops. Inserting species, of course, is going to change a system. Disturbing the soil, adding all these inputs to control the sides, right? Side means to kill. Anything we do to move water, control water, anything we do to try and enhance the ecology. So I'm on my 2nd farm that hasn't had topsoil, and because it's been depleted, and that is a slow process. But what I'm doing is a disturbance in adding the things that cover crops and the inputs, the compost, to create topsoil in that environment. Mowing, burning, things we all do. We're all disrupting this ecological system. So regenerative agriculture is looking to minimize those disturbances. We want to mimic, and that means we have to first understand a healthy ecological cycle, and then we want to mimic the systems in that cycle as much as possible as we tend it. And you guys can all read the screen, but maximizing that maximizes our health as well. There is nothing that exists in a vacuum here. All right. The soil is my love and my obsession. So you'll see I always have a lot of slides about soil health in here if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards. The soil is a complicated system. Full of all kinds of biological activity, all kinds of fungal activity. It has important structures, and it is destroyed by poor management practices, overgrazing, confinement, tillage, but it can be restored by proper practices as well, including rotational grazing. So we all have to ask ourselves, whether you're at the grocery store or the farmer's market, or I'm standing in the field, or I'm at the grocery store or the farmer's market, what are we doing? How does this decision I'm making impact the space? And what we're doing now, the systems in place on agroecology or regeneratively managed operations like I'm on right now, we have to think differently. The difference between the confinement and the conventional agriculture and sustainable and regenerative systems is the difference between selling rocket ships and working at, Hardee's. They're not the same thing. And I'm not saying that one is harder than the other. I'm saying they are not interchangeable. So there's that relearning and unlearning that has to happen for farmers to make a transition. But it's a constant process. It's taken me years and years. What happens if I do nothing is the first question we always ask, whether we see an insect, we see a disease, we see a plant variety that is not thriving, we see an animal who's struggling. What happens if I do nothing? Once you've assessed that, then you can figure out which disturbances might be the best disturbances for the situation. Using things that are biologically available is incredibly important. Having the diversity in soil, in plant life, in animal life, in our perennials is incredibly important for maintaining biological diversity, and that builds resiliency into our systems. And don't forget that people are part of the cycle. People are part of agriculture. They are part of the cycle. So how we treat our consumers, our integrity, which we verify through certifications on my farm or on the farm I run, but also how we treat our staff and our labor and our neighbors and everyone impacted by our decisions is critical. Kim touched on some of this already, but what can you do to help us move forward into the food system that we're about to describe? Keep doing this. This is very good. Keep being involved in these events. Find the information. And you need to be very careful that you are corroborating things. And we talk about this all the time, but there's a lot of kind of one-off opinions about things. When something's becoming established, find several sources for that. Most people who are doing the research are really happy to have that research shared and spread, and you'll find that they famously put out these clickbait headlines that say like chocolate's good for you now, right? And all this kind of stuff. I would avoid the clickbaity one-time studies of 12 people, right? And focus on those big picture things. You're concerned about CO2 release. There are maps showing the globe and a time-lapse release of that. Look at the big picture. Look at those things. And then it'll help you make your smaller picture decisions. Definitely shop local when it's available to you. So supporting things like CSAs, farmers markets, getting on local harvests, which Kim showed you earlier, calling around. We field phone calls all day long. So does the other farm in Hamilton County that is doing the same methods we are. We're constantly trying to connect people. Sometimes I get calls from other states and they say, how do I do this? And I, walk them through getting online and finding things in their area. But it's worth a little bit of homework. And then once you start making those relationships with farmers and with people at the market and with, restaurateurs and all these things, that networking will continue to snowball. Terminology we're about to talk about, I'm going to roll into that a little bit right now. So the term organic, unless you are a tiny producer, is legally reserved for farms who are USDA certified organic. We are certified by a third party that represents us to the USDA and gets us our certification. It's a long process. It's an arduous process. There's a lot of record keeping involved. My inspector comes by once a year. They go through huge stacks of paper with me and they randomly choose crops and they follow it from my purchase of that seed every time that seed was handled until it went out into the community, who got it, and the condition of that seed. So it's intense. But because it's intense, it has meaning behind it. You can look at the national organic standards. Beyond national organic standards, because there's so much industrial representation in the ag space, there's also the Real Organic Project certification. We get that as well. That shows we've gone above and beyond the minimum standards for organic. Regenerative is a term that, much like sustainable, is easily co-opted by corporate interests, by the industrial agriculture space. So usually what you're going to see happening, and this has been the trend since the term natural, is that a term will be used by people who are trying to move the conversation forward, the more progressive farmers, and then it's seen as valuable in marketing, or it's seen as a threat to a system. And the term will start being used and the definition will be shifted by louder voices. So we call that greenwashing usually. There's a term that started with the intent to have a specific meaning, and now it's just become something to sell things to you. So I have an entire 2-hour class that I give about labeling, but I find that certifications offer you the best guidance and guarantee and a relationship with your farmer. You can come to my farm and I'll show you around, and I'll show you what we use and where we use it, and I'll even let you work. Help other people through this process. It can feel complicated at first. It can feel like something you just don't want to mess with at first, but if someone is interested, we appreciate people being ambassadors for careful purchasing in the food supply. Make sure your kids know why you're doing the things you're doing. Eat seasonally, eat close to the sun as an eater. Close to the sun being, instead of focusing your meals around products that are way down the caloric chain. So the sun is turned into energy in plants, and then those plants, if they're being fed through an animal, that's a less efficient path than you just eating the plant directly. So that's what we say, eat close to the sun is another way to say eat more plants, eat less meat, and eat even less processed, highly processed foods, right? And then this is dear to me, but support the restaurants who support local farms. If a restaurant, even if it's marketing, is bragging about purchasing from a local farm, please encourage that and tell them you're there because they're doing that. Those purchases help us build the necessary supply chains that are not in place for local growers, and we need all the help we can get. All right, the future of the food system. I don't think I'm being overly optimistic about this, but eaters need to reconnect with farms. I often tell people a generation or two ago, everyone had a grandparent or parents who had some relationship to a farm, and that is no longer the case. Obviously, land access is a huge issue, but my generation, people who are midlife at this point, are much less likely to have had any contact with the farm. And my children's generation frequently couldn't tell you if a tomato grew on a tree or underground. So those relationships are incredibly important. And I think in the future, we are definitely seeing a trend with the increase in CSA programs in the country, and with the increase in that marketing of purchasing local, we're seeing that interest, market-driven improvements in that area. We are going to have more small-scale farms in the future. Even without a lot of support from legislation, you can't get into large-scale farming. It's an exclusive space that is being largely purchased by companies and conglomerates. So it's not reasonable to think that most people, save billionaires, can go out and purchase 4,000 or 5,000 acres to row crop, plus millions of dollars in equipment to do so. So small scale farms are where things are growing. You're going to see more table food production, particularly as we see supply chain issues like we've had recently. See first the pandemic, and now war in Eastern Europe has really woken people up to concerns about the fact that we ship food back and forth across the planet, and that many of our areas are not equipped for long season growing. Land access is going to increase, I think, as we see groups like SILT and land trusts enable young people to get in with small scale acreage. you can produce per acre, if you're doing diversified specialty crops, you can produce more money's worth of crops on a small farm than you can in large scale monocrop operations. So that's the upside. People will be able to get in there. People are starting to care. You're all here today. Reach out to your legislators, but we have more and more people who are starting to realize the issues with the food supply who are in office, and it is no longer a dead issue. 20 years ago, if you suggested regenerative agriculture instead of just saying family farm over and over and over on a stump speech, you would be laughed out, because real farmers were in $400,000 combines, and that perception has shifted, and legislators are aware of that. Legislators. We are going to see continued growth of education about food and ecology in schools, and I'm really excited. I see this in our school system here in Hamilton County, and the Chicago school system has food programs, garden programs. Even the LA school system has gardens at every school. So we're going to see more contact there between young people and food, and that will create a better informed consumer base. Markets, farmers markets are still increasing and growing and becoming places where people regularly shop again. There are parts of the world where going to the market is still the norm, or is the norm once again. And we're getting back to that in areas where we have a population to support it. That does kind of leave rural folks out, just a whole nother discussion. And again, meat consumption. Eat meat or don't eat meat, the meat you eat should be high quality. If you want the B12 that is available in beef that has been grass-fed as opposed to grain-fed, you need to buy grass-fed meat, right? If you are going to pay more for meat because it's out on grass instead of being grown in a CAFO, then it's reasonable to think you're going to have to eat less meat to afford that. And that is the direction the world is going in. So as countries are being exposed to industrial agriculture, their meat consumption starts to skyrocket, and their health eventually, there's an inverse, and the health starts to decline. And then as those areas gain more wealth and more development towards progressive farming systems, meat consumption then declines. So that's what we want to, that's what we see for the future. There are tools for farmers. I'll skip past this here, but there's some really fantastic tools for farmers who would like to reach out and learn about the steps they could take to start that shift in perception and understanding. And these are pictures from Teeter. So I work for a nonprofit farm. We have a mission, a multi-part mission, but at the top of my priority list as the farmer is donating produce to the local food bank and food pantries, meal programs, people in need. Hamilton County is incredibly wealthy, but we're 8th in the state for per capita hunger and food insecurity. We have a big population, so it's still a lot of people. The numbers from Feeding America fluctuate year by year. Anecdotes from that food pantries are that of the 27 roughly 1,000 people in Hamilton County who were food insecure in 2019, we've had around a 40% increase during the pandemic that is just now starting to decline. That is just an inordinate number of hungry people. So this farm was originally in a trust as a retreat under Noblesville First United Methodist Church. And in 2016, they started growing food for the community on the property. And that's where we are today. And we're scaling that up. And we have over a mile on the White River. So like I said earlier, looping this back to the beginning, I see people in the river and I know the history of the river, and we've all read the reports about the pollution in the river. And we refuse to contribute to it. And it matters for everyone. So we are transitioning to regenerative on a million different fronts, and supporting farms like this one, supporting farms like Full Hand, which is also, it's on the edge of our county, northern edge of our county. There are some in Boone County that I'm aware of who are using livestock, intense rotation livestock on pastures, Fisher farms in Indiana. these places are working hard to be good citizens in our communities, to be good neighbors, and how our land gets used has an impact for everybody in our area and everyone downriver. Indiana contributes an inordinate amount of fertilizer to the Gulf of Mexico in the dead spot there, and all the animal waste that we have to get rid of. So thank you for being cognizant consumers, and thank you for your generous hearts towards farmers who are trying to figure this out and move us forward. And I am ready to answer questions at any point.
Thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate that. I just wanted to pop in here and point out, I'm sure Kim is already on top of it, but there are a couple questions for you in the chat box. So I don't know, Kim, if you want to just kind of take those over and you can start any discussion that way.
That sounds really great. Let me catch up here. And also, you guys can turn your cameras on if you want, and use the little emoji to raise your hand if you want to ask a question without typing it in chat. Either way works for me. Okay, let's see. So, Katie, I actually have the first question for you. So I'm aware of a very large dairy CAFO in Indiana. It's actually one that I'm involved in litigating against, and they claim to be certified organic. So I was interested in your discussion of the organic certification process as being intense. My question is, are there some loopholes in that process that allow industrial producers to take advantage of it?
It's an excellent question, Kim. Yes, there absolutely are. So it's an intense process, but the standards are not intensely stringent. It's every fall, farmers and stakeholders also being industry, are invited to sit in on the National Organic Standards Board hearings. And we're invited to sign up, to comment, and to look through the things that they're discussing. And I have a huge respect for everyone involved in that process who sits on the board, because they really get grilled and they have to make very difficult decisions. They have to make decisions about, whether carrageenan should be allowed in organics, and whether aquaponics. So if you remove the soil, can it still be organic if the inputs are otherwise organic? And all of these decisions. And through those processes, industry has won out in that regard, that there are CAFO situations that are allowed to be certified. And that's where we are right now. There's a lot of arguing at those hearings. I think I spent 30 hours in hearings this fall, just listening. You know how fun that is, right, Kim? So
can't wait to do it again.
I know. I'll see you there. But yeah, there are absolutely not ideal standards in place. And I have learned that if I ask consumers to weigh in on everything that I have a strong opinion about for the standards board, they will burn out and not be involved at all. So I appeal to fellow farmers who are stakeholders in this space. But what happens is everyone signs up for those slots to speak and weigh in, and big companies will have a zillion different people sign up for slots, and so they'll get to speak for a long time, one after the other, and keep going. And it's not unheard of in the legislative world, right? Like you stack the deck in your favor, but it's not ideal. So the case at Teeter is that we're also real organic certified, which is a higher level. It allows fewer inputs and insists on soil being part of the practice. But dairy that doesn't say it, dairy can say 100% grass-fed if it's fed hay inside, not, you know what I mean? Because hay's dry grasses, right? So right. It gets a little complicated.